welcome to Furthering Christendom. I'm your host, Tyler McNabb, and I'm here with a friend and, more importantly, a hero of mine, William Lane Craig. Dr. William Lane Craig, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Tyler. It's really good to see you.
Good to see you as well. I think it's been maybe a few years now since the last time we talked at HBU, I think was.
That's right.
Going to have you come on today, talk about the Kalam cosmological argument. You know just a little bit about that, right?
Somewhat.
So I'm going to go ahead and read the questions just so I can make sure that I'm really accurate and precise in how I ask these questions to make sure we get the right sort of understanding there. So
Okay.
The first question I have, this is Joe Schmidt. He wrote an article recently on Prosblogion. It's been revived. Prosblogion's been resurrected. And he said this. He said, so Joe Schmidt has recently argued that a number of future events shouldn't be seen as potential infinite, but rather an actual infinite. He states the following: for a collection to be a potential infinite, that collection must grow as time progresses. This is part of the definition of potential infinite. It's a collection that's always finite, but ever increasing without limit. But as time passes, the collection of future days does not grow. In other words, the number of days later, then the moving now never grows or increases as time passes. In fact, as time passes, days are as removed from the future, placed in the present, and then receded into the past. So it's just false that a collection of future days ever grows as time passes. But since growing as time passes is a necessary condition on being potential infinite, it follows the collection of future days isn't a potential infinite. So thoughts on that? Do you think Joe goes wrong on some place?
Yes, I think that Joe's being misled by language here. He's correct, I think, in characterizing a potential infinite as a collection that is at every time finite, but increasing toward infinity as a limit. And one way to express that with regard to the series of events in time is that the past is actually infinite if it's beginningless, but the future, if it's endless, is merely potentially infinite. But what one means in saying that is that the series of events is potentially infinite in the later than direction. And that's unobjectionable. The series of events, if it had a beginning, is at every point finite, but it is adding more events one after another with infinity as a limit. Or another way a person could put it would be to say temporal becoming is potentially infinite. That is to say, it will go on endlessly. So I think that he's just catching at words here rather than putting his finger on a genuine problem.
All right. Well, I got another question from you, and this time I talked with Alex Mallpass, who you've had discussions with, and kind of gone back and forth in literature a little bit there. In your discussion with Alex Mallpass, that was related to the Kalam, Mallpass sketches out an argument for why you are committed to being, why if you are committed to it being impossible to have an infinite number of past events, then you need to be committed to there not being an infinite number of future events too. In one of your later responses, you argue that on presentism, there are no future events, rather less an infinite amount of them. Alex Mallpass has later argued that it doesn't matter that they don't exist now, for there will be an infinite number of future events. So there is still an actual infinite you still have to worry about. If one says that there are 0 future events, then Mallpass worries that time would end now. How would you respond to Mallpass?
Well, before I respond directly to the argument, Tyler, I think it's worth pointing out that this is a purely ad hominem objection. That is to say, it exposes no fallacy in the Kalam cosmological argument. It does not contradict or undercut any of the premises in the supporting arguments for the premises of the Kalam cosmological argument. It is simply an ad hominem argument targeting people who believe in immortality and in future that the soul or the resurrection or the world will go on forever. But if I were, say, a liberal theologian or a Hindu who doesn't believe in immortality, this objection would be powerless against me. It is only effective against people who believe in an endless future. And so the argument is purely ad hominem. It doesn't really show any philosophical flaw in the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, as for the objection itself, Mallpass is appealing here to the principle of mathematical induction to justify his claim that if the future is endless, then there will be an actually infinite number of events. And I think that's incorrect. The principle of mathematical induction conjoins what's called an induction hypothesis with an induction step. And the induction hypothesis would be that a certain number has a property, P. And then the induction step would be to say that if a number n has the property P, then its successor, n plus 1, will also have that property P. That's the principle of mathematical induction. And what Mallpass appears to be saying is that let's let P be the property, will be counted. And so he's inferring that if some event will be counted, then its successor will also be counted, and its successor will also be counted. And therefore, he infers that all of the natural numbers, that is to say, an actually infinite number of numbers, will be counted. Now, I think that there are two problems with this appeal to mathematical induction. First, we find once again this inveterate tendency to conflate tenseless logical operations on timeless mathematical objects with tensed operations on events undergoing temporal becoming. In other words, the objection doesn't take tense seriously. Suppose that the individuals that we're talking about, which are the values of n, do not exist timelessly or tenselessly, but only one after another, each one coming into being immediately after its predecessor passes away. We are then right back to generating a potentially infinite series of individuals, which each one comes to have P upon its coming into being. So you don't get an actually infinite number of individuals. You get rather potentially infinite number of individuals as they come into being and come to have the property P. Second problem is that the principle of mathematical induction doesn't in fact imply that all of the natural numbers have the specified property P, but rather that each natural number has the specified property. So applied to the world of temporal becoming, the fact that each event that there will be has a certain property does not imply that all of the events that there will be will have that property. The intuition that each implies all is understandable with respect to the tenseless discourse of mathematics, granted. But the successor relation, which holds timelessly in mathematics, doesn't hold in the same way when it's applied to a series characterized by objective temporal becoming. And I would remind us here of Russell's story of Tristram Shandy, who you may recall writes his autobiography so slowly that it takes him a whole year to record the events of a single day. And Tristram Shandy says at this rate, he'll never finish his autobiography. Well, Russell doesn't disagree with that, but what Russell does point out is that if Tristram Shandy lives forever, then no page of his autobiography will remain unwritten. That is to say, Tristram Shandy will write every page of his autobiography, but he will not write all the pages of his autobiography. So I think that this subverts this appeal to the principle of mathematical induction. What we get again is not an actual infinite, but a potential infinite that involves infinity as a limit that will never be reached.
I see. That makes sense. That's that's good. Third question, James East, he argues that just because removing identical quantities from identical finite quantities yields identical finite quantities, it doesn't follow that the same holds true with respect to infinite quantities. We need an argument, he says, for thinking the same applies to infinite quantities. And one might just argue that it strictly follows from transfinite math that removing identical quantities from identical quantities does not actually yield identical quantities. So anyway, thoughts on this objection?
Well, I think that James is wrong in thinking that this doesn't apply in infinite quantities. This follows from the logic of identity, not from the finitude of the quantities involved. They are the same quantity. They are identical. And so in the situation I envision, you would be subtracting identical quantities from identical quantities and getting non-identical remainders. And that's logically impossible. It has nothing to do with finitude or infinitude. It has to do with the logic of identity. Now, in fact, in transfinite arithmetic, James is wrong to say that it follows that you can subtract identical infinite quantities from identical infinite quantities and come up with non-identical remainders. On the contrary, in transfinite arithmetic, these inverse operations like subtraction and division cannot be performed with infinite quantities. You can do addition and multiplication with transfinite numbers, but you cannot do subtraction or division with them. They are ruled out. They're against the rules. But as I point out in my argument about Hilbert's Hotel, you can slap the hand of the mathematician who tries to break the rules by subtracting infinite quantities from infinite quantities, but you can't stop people from checking out of an infinite hotel. If you bar the door, they'll jump out the windows. So I think that James is incorrect here in failing to see that the problem here is occasioned just by the logic of identity.
That's interesting, appealing to logic here. Yeah, and I have a quick response to James East where I say, well, it might be that you don't need arguments per se, but it's just like a seeming. You look at transfinite numbers and you look at finite numbers, and you just realize that it just seems to you that the same rules that apply to finite quantities also apply to transfinite or infinite quantities. So I think that seems like a good move.
Yeah.
All right. So, in your opinion, what is the best objection to the view that you cannot traverse an actual infinite? And what would be your response to that objection?
Well, I think that the best thing that the critic can say here is that given that the past is beginningless, you have had an infinite amount of time to complete the infinite past. And that therefore there just isn't a problem, because for every event in the past that you specify, there is always a time at which that event occurred. And so there's a one-to-one correspondence between events and times. And so there's just no problem. Now, if you reply then, as I do, in that case, it makes it inexplicable why someone counting down the negative numbers from eternity past would finish today rather than yesterday or the day before that or the day before that, because by then he's already had an infinite amount of time to finish his countdown. Then I think the critic can do no better than to simply say there doesn't need to be a reason for why the person is finishing his countdown now rather than earlier. It's just a brute fact. And there is no reason. And my response to that would be to say that thinking that there needs to be a reason why he finishes today rather than yesterday, when in both cases he's had infinite time to complete his countdown, is not to presuppose some sort of sweeping principle of sufficient reason, such as Leibniz envisioned. It's simply to say, in this specific case, it cries out for an explanation why he is finishing today rather than yesterday or at any other point in time, when in all those cases he's had an infinite amount of time to complete his super task.
Okay, yeah, that's really good. All right. What I know right now you're busy doing a lot of things. Specifically one project. I won't mention it unless you want to, but it's really awesome. Do you have any plans in the future for more, I guess, developing the Kalam, or for responding to more kind of updated critiques of it? Do you have any plans for that in the future?
Yes, I do, Tyler. As you said, I am very busy working on one project, and that is writing a systematic philosophical theology. And the first volume of that theology is on the doctrine of God. And I have completed now an excursus on natural theology as part of this project. And this will include an up-to-date discussion of the Kalam cosmological argument with responses to people like Wes Morriston and Alex Mallpass and others, as well as an update on the astrophysical and cosmological evidence, response to Dan Linford, and all the current literature that strikes me as important. I'm not responding to videos that aren't peer-reviewed on the internet, but I am responding to the recent literature that's been published on the argument.
Awesome, wonderful. And I've got one more kind of surprise question, a fun question. Yeah. Chad McIntosh wanted me to ask this. And that's if you ever came home one day and your wife Jan, she said, I'm not convinced of the Kalam cosmological argument. How would you? What would you do? How would you try to convince her otherwise?
I honestly, I wouldn't be all that upset. It wouldn't bother me. I mean, as long as she still believes in God and wants to love and serve him, that would be just fine with me. And it wouldn't shake me at all that she doesn't accept the cosmological argument. But in fact, she does. And I would just use the same sort of illustrations. I think that bringing these arguments home to the layman are best done through illustrations like Hilbert's Hotel or Jose Bernadette's book with an infinite number of pages in it, or Proust and Kuhn's Grim Reaper paradox. I think that one is devastating. Al-Ghazali's illustration of Saturn and Jupiter orbiting the sun from eternity, or the one that I just gave, a man counting down all the negative numbers from infinity and ending at zero. I think that these illustrations bring home in a very forceful way the power of the argument. So I would rehearse these kinds of illustrations with her.
Well, you mentioned Proust and Kuhn's Grim Reaper paradox. Do you, for causal finitism, do you have any? Has there ever been an objection you've encountered thus far against that the Grim Reaper paradox, or that's given you pause, or do you think?
Well, the only one is that when you try to extrapolate the Grim Reaper paradox from an hour where the Grim Reaper will kill you at 1 o'clock if you're still alive then, or the Grim Reaper number 2 will kill you at 12:30 if you're still alive then, or Grim Reaper 3 will kill you at 12:15 if you're still alive then, and so on to infinity. If you extrapolate that out to the infinite past, then the argument becomes a little more difficult. What you have to say is that if you survive until January 1st of each successive year, then the Grim Reaper will kill you at that point. And in fact, you will not reach January 1st of any year in the infinite past because you would already be dead. But the difficulty there is that would mean that you never existed. So it's not as though you exist at midnight. You can't live beyond midnight, but you can't be killed by any Grim Reaper. In the case of the infinite past, you would never have existed if there were these Grim Reapers. So the situation then has to become counterfactual, something like, if there had not been a Grim Reaper, then you would have continued to exist. You see what I mean? And so I think that it does make the formulation of the argument a little more difficult, but I've tried to do that successfully so as to apply it to the infinite past and not just to the continuity of space and time.
Okay, no, that's good. Yeah, I've recently taught it in class in a philosophy of God course that I teach. And I told them, imagine that they're like elves from Lord of the Rings, and they're just like eternal, unless someone's going to like decapitate them, right? Unless an orc's going to get them. Like, they're just going to keep on living. And then I used the January 1st one instead of the time, because I found the same issues as well with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Thanks very much, Bill, for coming on. And if there's anything I can do for you, let me know. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you. You've been a great help already, Tyler, and appreciate having me on the podcast today.